On behalf of Imam Tariq El-Amin, resident Imam of Masjid Al-Taqwa, the Ta'aleem Committee Chair, Dr. Aisha El-Amin, the committee members, Dr. Lionel Allen Jr., myself, Rashida Fitzpatrick, and Dr. Gloria Bashir, I want to welcome you to today's Ta'aleem. Our presenter today is Ariz Saleem, and his topic is going to be Gems of Jilani, an introduction to the rich life and spiritual wisdom of Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jalani. Okay, without any further ado, I give you Brother Salim.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. Assalamu alaikum, beloved community. Um, this community, Masjid Taqwa, is just such a beautiful community. So I'm really happy to be here and to be invited here. I'm honored to be able to present today. For those that I think I know most people that are here, but just by way of introduction, my name is again Ariz Saleem. I work right now as a Muslim chaplain at UIC, and I'm a father to a couple of kids. Have a 9-year-old daughter, a 7-year-old son. And I chose this topic today, so that's pretty much personal intro. But I chose this topic today, one because it was sort of it was some reading that I was doing around the work of some a work of his that he's written, which is called Al-Fath Al-Rabbani wal-Fayd Al-Rahmani. You can hear the kind of rhyming there that's going on, but he was known to be a person that was very eloquent. But the book title, it's the Lordly Opening. And so in the language of the, scholars that were sort of in our history, in our tradition, that sort of intersect mystical or more spiritual, experiential side of things, when they talked about an opening or a fath can mean, we have al-Fatiha. The Quran opens, with al-Fatiha. But al-Fath can also mean like a military victory as well, or any kind of victory, or when a land is quote unquote conquered, or that same word fath is used in Arabic to show that, well, it's really a land now that's open, um, and free for the people there to worship God. But when they would use Fath, it would be almost like an epiphany or like a inspired moment for someone on their spiritual journey. So this is sort of the lordly openings, and Fayd is like a deluge, a downpouring. Ar-Rahmani being like the compassionate downpouring. But this book, it consists of, it's not written by him because he was known as somebody that um, spoke a lot, but it was his students that captured his words, and these are sort of spiritual sermons that are given to within a particular context that I'll get to, but these have been collected into a certain number and put together in this book. So I was reading this book and I found it also relevant and sort of reassuring, but also raised some questions in my mind, which at the end of this sort of introduction to his life and some of the stories that have been written and attributed to him or in regards to him, we can kind of enter into an exercise with that particular passage that I had read. And I just want to hear, the community's thoughts and reflections on their takeaways, and particularly how it sort of relates to what's going on around us right now with just a lot of uncertainty and turmoil, and with people picking, ICE picking up people, and deterioration of rights, etc. So I found it linked to that, and that's kind of why I chose this topic. Um, Before I get into it, do I have any quick questions on anything I've said so far? just
You
repeat.
said what's the name of the book?
Yeah, it's translated kind of funny, or I'm translating it in a funny way, but it's sort of the divine openings and the deluge of the merciful deluge.
Merciful Delusion. Okay.
Yeah, like
That's
the merciful downpouring. So it's like
okay.
a rain of mercy,
Oh, all
It's,
right. Very good.
it's
Very
very
good.
fancy, Al-Fath al-Rabbani. So the spiritual opening from God, that's lordly. Wal-Fayd al-Rahmani. And the downpouring that's merciful, the merciful downpouring.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. Very good.
Yeah,
Good.
we'll get to like a little part of it. So it's kind of exciting and interesting to see. Now, I'll get into time frames, so that'll be hopefully explained as I explain his biography.
Okay. Very-
So this biography is written or kind of pulled both from a lecture, but also, you know, a biographical dictionary. So the scholars of past would write dictionaries with entries of famous people in different fields, you know. And so this particular biographer, he's kind of famous. His name is Imam al-Dhahabi, was known to be that was someone that was sort of critical. You couldn't get him to praise somebody so easily and so quickly. And he was a historian, he was a hadith scholar, and to study hadith or the prophetic reports, you have to have an excellent memory and you have to sort of have critical thinking skills, and you're working through each report will have a chain that goes back to the prophet, and so you're authenticating each person in that chain. And
mhm,
so there's a heavy amount of memorization and data, you have to be able to carry almost like computer, like these people, had these computer databases, you could say, in their mind to be able to sift through all that information and make sense of it. So he was the person that writes about him has this kind of a reputation. But do I see no, that's just my own hand. Okay. So getting into it, he was called of Imam al-Ilm, which really means Imam of knowledge, right? So not just the Imam of a masjid, but Imam, the leading figure of his time in terms of knowledge. That's what he was denoted as. He was a scholar both of law, Islamic law, and as I said, about prophetic reports. Um, and in terms of law, there was actually, so we have the four legal schools within Sunni Islam: Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali. And all four of them essentially represent ways to, what's a good way to say this? Approaches to interpreting consistently the meanings from the Quran and the Hadith.
mhm,
So we want to ensure we're coming to we have a consistent way of deriving meaning from these things. Otherwise, it's sort of a free for all. So this sort of developed in our history. And so there were, in fact, two of these. Hanbali is what he was most famously known for. And the Hanbalis tend to be more focused on the Hadith. And they tend to also leave less room for reason to interfere in revelation. They were known to be a group of scholars. Their thinking is sort of shaped with, we don't want too much of this, we don't want our minds to get too far in the way that we approach revelation. We should sort of accept it even if it is not fully making sense. So they were kind of known to have that disposition. So he's a master in that legal tradition, the Hanbali tradition. Um, and he's described as Sheikh fil Madhab, which means like the Sheikh, the leading authority in that school of thought. Um, and he was also the same in a second school of thought, the Shafi'is. So he was pretty advanced in his learning. Other ways that he was described was a zahid. A zahid is someone, that's a term that they use to denote detachment from the world, the dunya, right? So ridding the heart of ties to this world. It doesn't mean you don't engage the world, but the world is not in your heart. And that's what they would call a zahid. And he was also described as an arif, which means knowing God, but knowing God experientially, not just sort of through book knowledge. So they had these figures, in this one sort of biographical and sorry, these words, these different technical terms that were used for him. Not all of them would be used for a single person. So someone could have, be known as someone that's somewhat detached and also has this experiential knowledge, but maybe they're not so advanced in law or in hadith, prophetic reports, or, theology or another discipline. But this is somebody that was known to kind of bring these different disciplines together. So he's born in 470 after Hijri, so 470 years after the migration to Medina in Gilan, Persia, or Gilan. It's, the Arabs pronounce it Gilan, but I believe I've heard that Gilan is the more correct pronunciation in Persia. And this is in the Abbasid period, so, medieval, and in terms of, dating that we're more used to, 1077. So he's in the 11th century, 1077 when he's born. From an early age, he sort of back then there was a tradition of entering children into Islamic studies at a very early age. So that being the case, we have like scholars that would memorize the Quran by like an early age, like 9 years old, 7 years old. They would have, the entire Quran memorized. That would be the foundation of education. So he received this education in Gilan, in his own town, which was relatively small. But then, to get to the next level, you have to enter the metropolis where all the scholars are gathered and the expertise level is much higher. And so at this time, it was in Baghdad or Baghdad in Iraq, present-day Iraq. So that's the center of Islamic learning at the time. And it said that, he was aged about 17 or 18 when he gets to Baghdad and starts to intensify his studies with scholars, major scholars of the time. Since, as I said, it's a metropolis, this is kind of the hub of learning. Um, and, these centers of learning are not sort of what we would think of when we think of madrasas today as like a kind of a small school, community-centered school, but these were more comparable to like colleges and advanced colleges where people were taking care of their food and their drink, etc. They could live there, and a lot of their needs were provided for, but also in a way that was very abundant. Resources were abundant for scholarship at this time. So he ends up seeking the knowledge and achieving mastery in several disciplines. And not only did he sort of uh, get sort of a basic understanding of each of the various disciplines that go into becoming a scholar within the Islamic intellectual tradition, but he also advances in the more detailed nuances of each of these sciences and branches of those pieces of knowledge. So, and this is more his book journey, if you will. It said of him that this was sort of him mastering the rational aspect of what needs to be known of the religion at the time. And so, after mastering these sciences, it's said that he enters a period of intense spiritual training and seclusion. Um, and this was sort of something at the time that you would sort of have both teachers that would teach you knowledge of the books if you will, but they also had developed practices and ways of training the heart to to sort of overcome certain unwanted character traits, right? So like they had a a way of talking about these things, certain exercises that they would, recommend to their students so that it wasn't just that, a student would simply know things and be able to spit back information, but mentoring these people, really helping them achieve a high state of character. And so this was sort of, that's the milieu out of which this is coming from. So he also had his spiritual teachers. And so in this period, they say lasted anywhere between 10 to 20 years. So this is the part that's sort of interesting and different from what we're used to seeing. And you'll see that, he has a sort of heroic biography. So, you don't have to, I'm not expecting, well, just hear it out. I won't put any kind of qualification there. I'll just let you hear the story. So the idea of the spiritual training and seclusion and is to, as I was saying, clean up your heart, clean up shop, and to develop the muscles of the heart and to weaken the muscles of the lower self or the ego. And so that kind of some of the descriptions that get attached to these things are like the nafs or the lower self, al-bahimiyya, right? And al-baha'im are like beasts, cattle, right? So it's the cattle self, and the cattle self is the idea that human beings we share in cattle-like attributes in a sense that, when you think of a cow that's just sort of eating, grazing, eating, pooping, going through the sleep cycle, whatever they go through as animals, and that's pretty much it. That's what they're about. Um, but how do the idea being that this is something that you need to keep in check, moderate, right? And the same thing with, they would say, nafs al-kalbiya. So that's more of like the aggressive element in us, the element that gets angered and kind of like road rage side of things. And then they also would say nafs al-shaytaniya. So the shaytani nafs would be the nafs that is sort of cunning, the way that we sort of rationalize wrong actions or immorality, and we begin to convince ourselves of its truth. So that's just a basic, brief kind of understanding of the terminology they had developed to self-assess, like, oh, is that an inclination that's coming from a cattle-like place? Is that an inclination that's coming from a dog-like place? The dog, kalbiya means dog, that's like the anger when a dog barks. Or is this like an inclination that's coming from a more, self-deluded place of me deluding myself into thinking certain things? Was someone gonna say something? No? Okay.
No, sir. We're just paying
Okay.
attention. We're just
I just wanted
following
to
the
I just
presentation.
saw maybe Sister Anissa because I saw she was I wasn't sure if she wanted to say anything because it wasn't on mute. So I thought, but I'm gonna assume I'm gonna keep going unless somebody wants to share a thought or a question. So so he lives alone as a stranger in these desolate lands and desert plains in, sort of Iraq area to undergo these spiritual exercises. And it's not clear exactly how long he does this, but they say 10 to 20 years. And it said that at the age of 50, he both has sort of this vision of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam encouraging him to sort of go back into public life, leave this life of seclusion. You need to benefit people now. And he received similar, it said, encouragement from his teachers, that you've kind of done the project of moral cleansing. Now you need to benefit other students and other people. So when he does this, he becomes, a well-known preacher, but he stands out in that he's not somebody just, when you become a scholar in that environment, you're responsible for writing books as sort of somebody that's doing a PhD would, right? Like you're publishing, so you're writing and you're writing for uh, other students to understand disciplines at an advanced level. So you're not just, you're writing to a particular audience that's already in tune and at a certain level of education. You might also write for the public as well, but you're also teaching your students at these seminaries. And the thing that makes him stand out a little bit is that he would also his preaching would be also geared towards the broader public, and through that side of his personality he became very influential. He became somebody that people were sort of mesmerized by his ways and his eloquence and his sort of spiritual reminders to people. um so he struck ordinary people as someone that had a very powerful presence. And so many in his time, including today, people will say that, certain what we would categorize as supernatural events were attributed to him. Again, you don't have to believe these things, but I like to just share, what's been written about him, what's attributed to him. But most famously, what he was sort of known for is that he could pick up on people's thoughts in the moment. And if you want to sort of go on that mental journey with me, there is telepathy and other things in like trans psychology that people have spoken about. So it's not altogether unscientific, but he was known for that. That was one of the things that he was known for, is that if you had he would know the internal states of people and speak to that, and they would kind of be like, "What? How did you know what I was feeling or thinking?" Right? So that's been attributed to him. Um, and the term for that, again, they had developed these spiritual terminologies. So a khatira is like an occurrence, an unvolitional thought that occurs to you, like just happens, right? That's how they perceived of thought. So you can have thoughts or these thought occurrences, thought events that occur in a way that can either be angelic, or it can be satanic, or it can come from your lower self, where you're prioritizing base instincts over something that's more noble and truthful. So, when they're talking about Sheikh Abdul Qadir having this insight into what someone is, thinking or feeling, they would say he would know the khawatir of people. He would know what's sort of going on, the inner events of their mind at times. So I'll share some fun stories about that in a moment. But it also was said that nearly 100,000, because of that sort of charismatic and influential personality that he had and that engagement with the public, um, it said that 100,000 people sort of, when they would use the word tauba, we know tauba as like repentance, right? But when tauba or somebody, repented at his hands, that was terminology to indicate that someone sort of was transformed, sort of like their life was transformed as a result of this person. So they could still be believers, but it was the fact that they were on a path that was immoral and their whole life was turned around. So it's kind of the story of someone that okay. It's kind of the story of like someone that may have had a rough start, but I've just thrown like an example out there. Like we're all inspired by Malcolm X's story of like going through that period, but then coming out completely transformed and inspirational for so many people. So he has this tendency to take people that are vulnerable, that may be seen as immoral at a certain stage in their life, and he sort of they really shift their trajectories. So he did that for a large number of people. It was also said that, in Iraq, in Baghdad, there were Jewish people, Christian Arabs, and that nearly 500 were known to have come into Islam through their engagement with him. And he was so influential with sort of ordinary people, but also with the elites of his society. So there were famous military rulers that would go on to do very important things in Islamic history. So Salah ad-Din, who is known to have sort of freed, you know, um, Palestine, from during the Crusades. He's known for, a period of time where he freed Palestine from Christian hands, if you will. Um, he took the advice of Sheikh Abdul Qadir seriously. He was influenced by him, and political leaders likewise would come to him, seek his advice and guidance. So he eventually also, and then I'll say a final word. But as far as the biography, and then I'll get into some stories, but because of this sort of influential image that he has impacting different strata of society, um, in addition to that, he became sort of a spiritual father for later spiritual orders. So if you know about Islamic history, you'll know that in at a certain point in time, there's a development of spiritual orders, different spiritual orders, and at first, that phenomenon is sort of looked at a little bit with suspicion because people, in general, mysticism is perhaps looked at with a level of suspicion, but eventually it's sort of integrated into mainstream scholarship. But within restraints. So it's sort of the unrestrained, we had tendencies, for example, where it's like, well, you can reach a certain point of epiphany where you no longer need to follow Islamic law because God delivered you. It's kind of like nirvana. You're there, you're good, you don't need the law anymore. So those are the kinds of spirituality that mainstream scholarship sort of marginalized, and then they took in a version of it that they were comfortable with, if you will. That later develops into these orders, and then of course you have wilder, people that may be engaged in things that were more questionable, people that were more mainstream. So he became like his name became attached to one of these orders, the Qadri order, spiritual order, and so he becomes the eponym of the earliest spiritual order in our history as well. And he dies at 87 years of age in Baghdad, the city of where he was teaching, um, in the year 1166. So that's his a simple kind of overview. I'm sure I could say more, but I wanted to get into the stories. But before I do you guys have thoughts, reflections?
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam, brother Shahid. How are you?
Praise be to Allah. I'm good. And you?
I'm doing good, alhamdulillah.
Thank you for presenting Jilani to us in a more in-depth, I'll say, presentation than I've had before. I'm familiar with him, but not to the degree that you're, bringing them to us today. When you were referencing the different, I think, levels of um, I'm not quite how to say it when you're saying that they may be coming from a that was of a lower level and maybe one of a higher level or middle level or something like that. It made me think about the levels that I'm familiar with in the Quran with the al-lawama and
Mm-hmm.
mukmaina, the
Mm-hmm.
higher one, and
Mm-hmm.
it was interesting the way that um, the Quranic um, explanations or labeling
Mm-hmm.
of those levels don't seem to have been used by Jelani.
Yeah, that's a good question or comment, reflection. They are definitely a part of the tradition, but what they do is they it's like they take it as a beginning point. So nafsul mutma'inna, nafsul lawama, like the blaming self when we do something wrong, that conscience that comes up and like makes us feel bad about it, that's a level. And then mutma'inna is sort of the satisfied, the level of satisfaction with God. And then you have amara bisu, which is like the one that commands to evil all the time. That's like the taxonomy of the Quran. So I would just add that it was used by scholars, and the three that I mentioned was not necessarily what Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani speaks of. I just wanted to give an example of some of the ways that the scholars conceptualize these things with different terminology. So they might say, for example, that, Bohemia, which is like the cattle-like self, the lazy self that just likes to become a couch potato, the aggressive, angry self that like leaps out wrongfully at people, that doesn't know how to restrain anger, and the sort of clever self that likes to create, rationalizations for things we know or we lose sight of being wrong. They might say that all three of them belong to the level of the self that's commanding to evil. So they would build taxonomies off of what's in the Quran, and they would use them as well. So the lingo would definitely go back to the Quran, but then there would be extensions too. Some would say, oh, there's 7 levels to the self, so they would kind of divide them up differently. And some of that, it could be hadith that they're referencing, it could be their teachers' experiences and the language their spiritual teachers chose to utilize. So it's a good question that I think would require more research to know where exactly they come from, but I just wanted to say they don't not use the Quran.
It wasn't um, a question in regards to them differing from any Quranic reference.
Mm.
For me, it was like an expansion, so to speak,
Yes.
on the
Okay. Sorry.
ideas.
Forgive me.
Yeah, no, 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 no. That was good. I really appreciate that answer. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Brother Shahid. Okay, let me share a couple of stories and then we can go into reflection, maybe the last 15 to 20 minutes. So, here's some of the stories that have been, kind of fun. You could say, some of the scholars, in sort of Islamic studies would probably categorize these as hagiographical, which is like, they would doubt the authenticity of these things. But that's more like how Western scholarship would see it. But nonetheless, I'm going to share these stories because they've been written down about him. So one of these is sort of that there's a student, within this seminary world, the scholarly world, where students are coming and sort of building up their knowledge in these institutions. Sheikh Abdul Qadir is like, has is at the head of his institution or one of these institutions in Baghdad that's very reputable. And this particular student falls into some doubts about belief. And what gets him there is that one of the disciplines that in Islamic history is formed is called kalam, which literally means speech, but it has to do with theology, but theology approached more from a philosophical and rational lens. So, getting into things like, okay, there's a hadith in which the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is described as coming to the lowest heaven at the last third of the night and seeing which of his servants are calling out to him. So, when the philosophical sort of theological trend starts to tackle these questions, or when Muslims are exposed to broader philosophical trends around them, they are forced to engage some of these pieces of revelation or revelation in general by engaging reason and philosophy. So they have to integrate it to an extent. So they'll ask questions like, well, we know that God is unlimited. um, he's beyond time, matter, and space. But if this hadith is showing it or talking about God in a way that he's descending, well, descent implies movement, movement implies change and body, and God can't have a body, so therefore we have to interpret this hadith metaphorically, right? And so using rationality to make sense of revelation, that's sort of part of rational theology or kalam, but another part is like also how do we use rational tools to defend our basic tenets in our creed? How can we use philosophical language to show that it is viable rationally to believe that there is a God, that God exists, and that God would send prophets, and that there would be a day of judgment. So it's almost like you could say rational buttressing of creedal beliefs. But when students would get into this field, and even today, when people, students of the tradition, Islamic knowledge, try to get into this particular field, there's usually a period of doubt that naturally enters because you're using your critical mind for things that you've held to be true all of your life, and it's being challenged by, well, what if somebody says this? And what if somebody says this? How do you respond? So this particular student was sort of starting to feel a little unsettled about what he, up to that point, felt was secondhand to him in terms of basic beliefs. And he had also heard that Sheikh Abdul Qadir was somebody that kind of is in tune with what's going on with people, inside. So he decides to go to one of his gatherings, where he's exhorting the students and sort of building them up, talking to them, preaching to them. And so as soon as he enters, uh, the man, the line that he hears is that our belief is the belief of the righteous predecessors that have come before us and the companions. Like we're getting our belief right from the main source, essentially. And he's like, no, that's got to be a coincidence, you know. Sometimes, you know, people are just talking or whatever. Then then he notices that um the next he repeats his statement and then looks directly in his eyes this time, you know, that our belief is the belief of the righteous pious predecessors. And then he's like a little bit shocked, but then he again says, nah, that it's probably just a coincidence. You know, I'm just sort of in the crowd. Sometimes the speaker will look directly in the eyes of various members of the crowd, and then, you know, he just kind of brushes it off. And then he actually says his name, and he tells him, you know, uh, he tells him, "Go home. Your father just came back from the pilgrimage." You know, at this point, he's just totally like stunned, and he runs out of the gathering and he goes home. And in fact, it is the case that his father has just gotten back from the pilgrimage. But this is like a small story that kind of illustrates these small experiences or these kinds of experiences that people had with him, or say, you know, it's been written or attributed to having occurred, right? Um, Other kind of maybe less sort of miraculous like occurrences would be that, you know, he was someone that was very dedicated to the poor. So it's said that because of his sort of influence and charisma, many influential people would come to him and would give him offerings and gifts. So in a given day, he would be given gold and other valuable items, and he was known to put them under his prayer rug in a very kind of location that was very discernible and easy to pick up that okay, yeah, you know, there's valuable items there, so that when the poor would come visit him, he would reach from under the rug and give to them. So it became kind of a habit that he would redistribute wealth basically on behalf of the wealthy to the poor people. um other sort of like more on the sort of spiritually what you know, wacky side of things, if you will, when he was he in his public renown, which is his later life, as I said, it was 50 when he sort of gave up that life of seclusion and he sort of comes out and begins to engage more publicly. This is another sort of incident that was attributed to him. He says in front of another student, he's like, I wish I was still roaming around in seclusion in the deserts and open lands like my earlier days. And so by that, he's basically saying, you know, I'm not really a fan of this public life and renown and kind of, you know, I prefer to it just to be me and God, you know, and I'm just with him. I'm not known by the people. I'm just doing my spiritual exercises and in my own world. But then he says, but God willed for me to benefit his creation. And then he speaks of heavy loads come upon me. They are so heavy that if they were laid on mountains, they would crumble. When this happens to me, I'll lay down on my side and continue saying, Inna ma'al usri yusra. Indeed, with difficulty comes ease. And I'll say, I'll lay to my side and I'll repeat this again and again and again. And eventually, when I lift my head back up after some time, those burdens have passed, you know. And this kind of, you know, is sort of a mysterious anecdote, you know, sort of alluding, I believe, to this idea of him, you know, dealing with, you know, some kind of spiritual burden that maybe ordinary people wouldn't be dealing with. Allahu alam, you know. But those are a few of the stories from his life. I know people can probably not always the most charismatic storyteller. They were told to me in more entertaining and lively ways, but I wanted to share them. Okay, so all right, before we go into the reflection piece, um, okay, let me say these last three sayings. Another thing he said is that I've closely examined all righteous deeds. I've looked like at all the deeds one can possibly do that get the reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that are righteous and wholesome. And he says, I found nothing more virtuous than feeding others. So that was one of the things also. Thank you. That's Imam Tariq. Um, so one of the things that, you know, the spiritual order that kind of goes back to his name is that they would become known for, large soup kitchen type places, so that would feed the poor, so he was someone like that as well. So he says, I found nothing more virtuous than feeding others. He would also say, I wish the world were in my possession and I would use it all to feed the hungry, right? And another incident, he says, the palm of my hand has a hole, right? But what he meant by that was that or he continues in this, saying, if there comes to me 1,000 dinars, which would be comparable to $1 million, a very high figure in our own time, he says, it does not remain with me until the next day. So that whole, kind of image of, people coming to him, influential people coming to him, and him sort of putting the gold and other valuable items in an area where it's very visible, and people that are less privileged are coming to him, and he's distributing them. So he doesn't keep any of it. So those are some of the things that are also attributed to him. Okay, let me give you guys a minute to just I have a particular saying that I wanted to for it to take up more reflective time. So maybe I'll take like one quick comment or question and then I'll go into that. Nothing? Okay.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam, Imam Rabbani.
Alhamdulillah, thank you very much.
Your name is a part of the book.
I know, all right. Of course, when you first mentioned it, I started reflecting on when I chose that name. And was it a rational selection or a spiritual influence? But I wanted to ask the Sheikh Jilani, did he give it? I'm sure he did, of course, being one of the great sheikhs, on the commentary on the attributes of Allah that you can share.
I don't know whether he wrote on that, you're saying?
Yes.
I would have to look and get back to you, but I will share he does in this set of sermons, but but I don't know if he has like a book on the attributes of Allah in particular. What I've heard about him is that he was very eloquent and he had this way of speaking, but it was his students that largely preserved his live speeches. And that's what that book is. It's like a preservation of his students taking down these things.
Yes. Thank you.
So let me sort of, without further ado, give you a little bit of a taste from it, right? So these are like young people, young scholars, that are coming to get trained up at his seminary, and he's giving them these fiery speeches. He was also known to have this fiery way of speaking to the people, right? So he says, Ya qawm, O people, La taya'su min ruhillah, don't despair of the relief from God, wa farajihi, and his relieving you, فَإِنَّهُ قَرِيب, because indeed that relief and that succor is near. La taya'su فَإِنَّ الصَّانِعُ Allah, don't lose hope, because indeed the doer, and what he means by that is that the ultimate doer, because all actions are essentially God's act. There's no act outside of God's act. So he's saying, فَإِنَّ الصَّانِعَ Allah, that indeed the worker, the one that's actually at play behind everything that's occurring, is God. And then he quotes an ayah from the Quran that you never know, perhaps God will make something new to occur afterwards. Then this is the part that I want you all to focus on, especially in light of things that are going on. But what can this really mean? And I think it's more of a spiritual disposition, more than even a physical thing we're supposed to be doing. So he says, لا تهرب من البلاء. Do not flee from trials. فإن البلاء مع الصبر أساس لكل خير. He says, indeed, try the trial with patience, right? So bearing the trial with patience is the foundation of every good. So do not flee from tribulation and trial. Indeed, patience, bearing the trial patiently, is the foundation of every good. Continues, Asasun Nubuwa, It is the foundation of prophethood, wal-risala, and messengership, wal-wilaya, and having divine intimacy and friendship with God, wal-ma'rifa, and truly knowing God, wal-mahabbat al-bala, and even having a kind of love for the trial, an embrace of the trials that come. Then he continues, فَإِذَا لَمْ تَصْبِرْ عَلَى الْبَلَاءِ, and if you don't have patience with the trial, فَلَا أَسَاسٌ لَكَ, then you have no foundation. You have no foundation. لَا بَقَاءَ لِبَنَاءٍ إِلَّا بِأَسَاسٍ. Then he says there is no standing or remaining for a building that does not have a foundation. أَرَأَيْتَ بَيْتًا ثَابِتًا عَلَى مَزْبَلَ رَبْوَةٍ. He says, do you see a house, a firm house that is upon a heap of trash? Like, is that how building, have you ever seen something like that? إِنَّمَا تَفِرُّ مِنَ الْبَلَاءِ وَالْآفَاتِ لِكَوْنِكَ لَا حَاجَةَ لَكَ فِي الْوِلَايَةِ وَالْمَعْرِفَةِ وَالْقُرْبِ مِنَ اللَّهِ. And that translates as, you only flee from the trial and the afflictions because of your having no need and no desire for true intimacy, knowledge, and closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then he says, Isbir, have patience, wa'mal, and do good, hatta tasri bi qalbika wa sirrika wa ruhika ila babil qurb. Then he says, have patience and work good until you travel with your heart and your innermost being and your spirit to the gate of nearness to your Lord. So that's the segment, or one of the segments I wanted to share with you guys, is that what does it mean, to not flee from calamity, and the idea of being patient with our calamity being the foundation of not only every good, but even of people of prophets become prophets, of messengers becoming messengers, of divine intimacy, of knowing God. So I'll stop here.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Walaikum assalam.
Okay. That was beautiful.
It was.
You know, you may find yourself at different points in your life, maybe like running away from your troubles. But what I felt was a establishment of a discipline in the human being to sort of run towards the problem, or I'll say engage the problem, whatever, engage the situation with patience and trust in Allah. And if you don't have the knowledge to deal with it at that time, either Allah will bless you with it, or you'll learn through tribulation. That was beautiful that he gave there.
Thank you, Brother Shaheed. Anyone
Thank you.
else like to comment on sort of what?
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam, Brother Bashir. How are you?
Alhamdulillah. Jilani, is he considered a philosopher or a poet or both?
I think you could probably put him in a way both, because he had this beauty with his words. He had a way, you can kind of see why people would be impacted, with the way that he spoke. But yeah, I'd probably say a little bit of both.
Okay. The other is the question of the period of time that he lived in, 400 years after the passing of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What is that particular period of time connected with a particular dynasty at that time? I know you talked about the Golden Age.
Yeah.
Al-Islam.
Yeah. This was, I would say, the golden age era. It's like the Abbasid dynasty. So the
Okay.
Abbasids.
All right. Now, the other question, too, because we have poets in the African American uh, society that it came up recently in here in America, since we've been in America. Maya Angelou, uh,
Mhm.
uh, I can think of first name Sanchez, quite a few.
Mhm.
And their poetry was came out of situations that uh, were happening at that time.
Mhm.
How do you see Jelani's poetry in relationship to what was happening at his period of time and happening in the world that he was living in at that time, and how that influenced what
The way
he
he,
gave us? Yeah.
yeah, that's a really, really beautiful question. I think one thing that I can share is that in his time there was also somebody that in the Muslim community has become more and more prominent, the name Ghazali. Imam Ghazali was sort of a contemporary in this time, and one of the issues during this time is that, Islam has expanded, and therefore there's a lot of wealth. And with that wealth, there is um, a lot of the motivation for a lot of these religious leaders and scholars in particular. They gravitated towards law because law was very highly paid, because it was the legal scholars that were pretty much running the courts, right? And, just like you have a Supreme Court here with all the various appellate courts that are underneath it, there was a system like that in which the Islamic legal scholars had that kind of level of authority. And so a lot of people were partially joining this, but out of material motivations. So I think for Ghazali, that was one of his reasons for critiquing, and like a lot of it's sort of reflected here in Sheikh Abdul Qadir Jilani's speeches, is that he speaks to people to rectify their characters, and particularly those that he's shaping up and mentoring for religious leadership. And so I think there's a kind of, in this milieu, a kind of deterioration of and like superficiality to Islamic learning that sort of crept in because of the influx of wealth and these other things. And some of these scholars are fighting against that. I think there's probably more to this question, but that's as much as I can offer right now.
Another thing I'd like to offer, uh, Imam Muhammad Muhammad Rani Allahu Anhum, he wrote a book of poetry.
Mm,
One of his friends, and I think it's one of his friends outside of this community, a person, say like yourself, told him, say, Imam Wati Muhammad, you should write poetry. I think you would be a good poet or write good poetry. I
mhm,
don't know if some of us are aware of it, but the Imam wrote a book. Uh, it's called 75 Select Poems from Imam Wati Muhammad.
mm,
And on the back of the book, it reads, from the heart and soul of Wallace, from the philosophical thinking and intellect of Imam Wati Muhammad. So, to my question was, was Jelani both a philosopher? Because it used to be, the Imam pointed out, it used to be a criticism of him that he was a philosopher who was using al-Islam for his Islamic thinking. So how to uh, if Jelani was a philosopher, is there a controversy that exists
around
or
him.
thoughts, different thoughts that exist within Al-Islam about philosophy and Al-Islam proper?
Hmm. So what I'll say to that is that with regards to Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, he's most known for his sort of spiritual sermon giving. So he's most known for his poetic preaching in a way. But in his own time, he was at the head of a seminary, an influential educator and an influential preacher. And his prose was very poetic, but he didn't necessarily write like a book of poetry that I'm aware of. But he may have. Many scholars did do that. So I just haven't heard, I may not have heard about it. The point about philosophy being sort of critiqued or philosophers being critiqued, there's definitely been a tradition of that because in that sort of golden age, Abbasid era, in the earlier part of it, there's a translation movement of Greek texts being translated into Arabic. And so a lot of Platonic, Aristotelian philosophy and principles and ideas start to flow into the Arab world, the Muslim world at the time. And, there are groups that assimilate that in more than others. And so so there is a suspicion towards philosophy going too far. Like you're pushing us to use our mind in violation of what we've known of revelation. So that negotiation does happen. And in that process, you do have a lot of people that would say the philosophers, for example, would say in that more classical period, were distinct from the theologians who had integrated philosophy, but for their own ends. They took in the tools of knowledge at the time, but for their own ends to sort of defend Islamic precepts. But the philosophers, they would say, for example, that um, you can get to truth without revelation. You can use your mind to get to truths without need for revelation, but
Mhm.
the revelation is there for common people whose intellects are weak and therefore they can't reach it on their own. That's just like an example of like a difference between like theological debates and philosophers. So philosophers were definitely eschewed and looked at with suspicion. And even theologians that would integrate it in would initially be looked at with suspicion before, as the generations passed, then they're like, oh, that contribution was good. It didn't really go against our basic theology. Plus, they used the tools of the time to speak to the people. So initially, yes.
We have one hand raised before we close out. We'll go ahead and recognize Amir and Roshana.
Assalamu alaikum, brother.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Okay, I'm familiar with Jelani in the real, not thoroughly, but I just wanted to say something that I got uh, from him as far as his emphasis on development. And let me just read this.
Mm-hmm.
It says, the inner pilgrim wraps himself in the light of the Holy Spirit, transforming his material shape into the inner essence and circumambulating the shrine of the heart, inwardly reciting the name of God. He moves in circles because the path of the essence is not straight, but circular. Its end is its beginning, and that kind of hit me.
That's beautiful. Where is
And
that from?
this is
that
this is just a little piece that's it's a compilation of some other brothers that masters, some other masters,
yeah.
And like I said, it's just and what's interesting is that T.S. Eliot says the same thing. So Jelani is uh, wide known among the Western world,
Mm-hmm.
not just Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
So, but anyway, that, like I said, that just kind of hit me And it just gives me the courage to just continue the path.
Mm-hmm.
Thank
No,
you.
that was a beautiful reflection. I like that statement that you quoted. Beautiful.
Okay.
Thank you, brother. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, we're gonna wrap this up, inshallah, with recitation of Surah Al-Asr. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Wal as inna al-insana lafi khusr illa alladhina hum yuwaswisu wa tawasaw bil haqq wa tawasaw bis sabr. Amin.
Amen.
Thank you so very
Amen.
much.
Thank you all for having me.
Beautiful
I really
presentation.
enjoyed sharing. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.